Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Samach Daled. We started Parak Rabbi Yishmael, and in this chapter we're going to start with this whole issue, particularly in today's daf, about what things override Shabbat. As I mentioned yesterday, right? It's interesting in terms of we're in the middle of a war here, and in terms of all sorts of issues that come up relating to what overrides Shabbat, what doesn't. If Shabbat is overridden, what are the guidelines? What is permitted within that? What isn't? And here we're going to have a lot of discussion, a lot of throwing things up in the air as usual, comparing, is this really the same? Is this not the same? And it's actually a fascinating sugya today. The first part is going to be all these different issues that come up relating to overriding Shabbat in different circumstances and comparisons. The second part of our daf, we're going to have a nice Agadah story also, which is actually a story we've seen twice before, but in kind of a different context here. And so in general, Menachot isn't always some, but I wanted to just show you that in Menachot, there's all these pockets of, even as we're going and kind of in the doughs and the flours and there's also, and which kind of thing and how do you bake it, but there's all sorts of other interesting sugyot that are really basic, fundamental sugyot that actually come up in Masechet Menachot. So this is a very fundamental sugya about when Shabbat is overridden, to what extent can you override? So let's just do a quick review. We started with our Mishnah in terms of these two machlokot, which wasn't exactly clear. Are they the same? Are they different? They're clearly somewhat different. And in fact, the Gemara today is going to go through some comparison of the two machlokot. So the first machlokot is Rabbi Yishmael says, the Omer ideally should come from 5 se'im to whittle it down to an isaron, because you will get the best isaron from 5 se'im. But on Shabbat, we're only going to do 3. And then the rabbis disagreed. Now, it's a weird disagreement because they basically say, well, there's no distinction between Chol and Shabbat, but they also don't think you even need 5. And that's why they say 3 is what you need, and you can do it both on Shabbat and Chol. So it's not 100% clear if the rabbis are completely disagreeing with the whole issue of, overriding Shabbat if there's a need, because they don't even think there's a need here. Okay, that's kind of a bit of a difference between the next machloket. The next machloket is between Rabbi Chanina's Kohanim and the rabbis about this whole issue. They want to do the Omer in a public way, which we discussed a bunch of different reasons why it might be. The key one being the Baitusim, but other ones about Berov on the Melech, maybe also to speeden up the process. So they would do 3 people would do the act of cutting, which they would do in the evening before, which, for Shabbat, then it was, Friday night, they would do it. Now, on Shabbat, there was this machloket, can you still do it with 3 people, or do it just with 1 person? So Rabbi Chanina's Kohanim said only 1 person, and the rabbis said, no, you could do it in the exact same way. Okay, the rabbis seem to be of the approach, if Shabbat can be, right, it's overridden, and you do it, right? You do whatever you need to do, and whatever the way it's normally done. But we're going to discuss this a little bit as we go on, and is this really the case in, across the board? What about different cases? So the first thing we had, or not the first thing, but we're moving out to the last part where we ended, Rabbah came and said that Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yishmael Benosh Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said the same thing. He quoted some other machloket, something the Gemara does very often. Let's compare cases, because that's a really good way to analyze what's exactly at the crux here. So he says these 2 people say the same thing. What do they say? Well, in this case of the 14th of Nisan coming out on Shabbat, and you have to eat the Korban Pesach Saturday night. You have to sacrifice it on Shabbat. So Shabbat is overridden for the sake of the Korban Pesach. But to what extent? You have to basically flay the animal. And you have to flay the animal for 2 reasons. One is you have to get the imurim out, which have to be burned, and that you have to deal with the day of, which has to be done on Shabbat. But the question is, would you flay the animal completely once you're already flaying? Or do you say only flay what you need? Really, the rest of the flaying is going to be done at nighttime. To eat the animal, right? To roast it, you're going to have to flay the rest of it, but that's for eating. So that the eating is done at night, wait till nighttime. Don't override Shabbat completely here. Or those who say, no, flay it completely. Okay, so Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said, listen, you don't need to flay the whole thing right now. You can wait till tonight where it's not Shabbat anymore, and therefore push it off. Okay, and that sounds like the same thing as Rabbi Yishmael. But the Gemara had said, and this is where we ended, Dilma adkan lo ka'amar Rabbi Yishmael hacha ela deleka bizayon kodashim. Maybe Rabbi Yishmael said it by us, don't do 5 se'im, do 3, okay? Because nothing is being disgraced by doing 3. But hatam deika bizayon kodashim, there it's sanctified items that are being it's a disgrace to leave an animal half flayed. It's like not treating the kodesh in a proper manner Maybe Rabbi Yishmael would agree with the rabbis in the case of Psachim and wouldn't side with Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka there because he'd say it's really an embarrassment to leave the kachim half flayed. Inami. Now we're going to do this a few times today, and each time we're going to say it's not clear that he would hold a kim, and then we're going to go the other way and say, right, we tried to say Rabbi Yishmael holds the same thing as Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Then we said it's not clear Rabbi Yishmael would actually hold by Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. And now we're going to say if we start with Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka on Pesach, and we look back at our case, it's not clear he would hold by Rabbi Yishmael either in our case. We can make a distinction in the other direction. So what's that distinction? Inami, alternatively, you could say, or in addition, you could say, Ad kalo kama Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka hatam eladit avid leitzarich gavoa v'lo tzarich ichule Shabbat. Now, you could say that Rabbi Yishmael says, no more flaying of the animal, don't flay it completely, because you've done exactly what you need for this korban today, right? You don't need to do anything further for the korban. You've done the korban has two elements to it. One is what you have to burn on the altar, that's for God. The other is what you personally need to eat, right? So to eat it, you're going to need to flay it. But that's tzorech hedyot, that's for your own purpose. For God, you've completely fulfilled your mitzvah. You've flayed it halfway, you've taken out the imurim, you don't have any more need for tzorech gavoa. And that's what was permitted on Shabbat, for God's sake, not for your sake. But in the case of the Omer, you haven't fulfilled your tzorach gavoa perfectly, because if you take only 3 se'ah and whittle it down to, remember 3 se'ah we said is an ephah, and you want to get from that ephah to an isaron, which is a tenth of an ephah. If you take 5 se'ah, you're going to end up with better quality, a better quality isaron. So for the purposes of God, which is the korban that you're bringing to God, you're going to have a better korban if you use 5 se'ah. So perhaps Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka doesn't allow it by the flaying of the animal, but he may allow it here and agree with the rabbis. Now this is tricky, because what does it mean to agree with the rabbis? Well, the rabbis said you don't never need 5, you only need 3. But the rabbis also don't distinguish Shabbat and Chol. So you have to say here, you have to make a little bit of a jump, and Rashi points it out, that what they mean here is Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka might agree with the rabbis here that if you take the approach that you need 5 se'ah on a weekday, you would also allow it on Shabbat to reap 5 se'ah, to cut them and all that, and do all the process of making flour out of it, because it's the tzorach gavoa, and you get a better product, and that in the end is a value. Okay, so it's not clear that they are saying the same thing. So after the Gemara rejects this, the Gemara says, Ela Amar Rabba. Okay, so then Rabba suggests something else. Now some of the Girsaot have Rabba here, and it's not Rabba, and maybe just the Gemara later rejected Rabba, and here's just Rabba saying something, or maybe Rabba heard the rejection and now suggested something else. Ela Amar Rabba, Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim Amru Davar Echad. This is how I started, and I said, the Mishnah brings 2 machlokot, and they sound kind of similar, and now they're going to suggest, oh yeah, it sounds like Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Chanina in our Mishnah both say, so Rabbi Yishmael again said 5 and not, right, do 5 in general, but only on Shabbat only do 3 se'ah, and right, that's how many grains you can collect from the field, and right, barley we're talking about, and according to Rabbi Chanina, okay, we're going to read it now inside again because the Gemara is going to quote it. Titna, Rabbi Chanina, they don't quote Rabbi Yishmael because that's what we're on in the Gemara. Rabbi Chanina, Skana Kohanim Omer, b'Shabbat niktzar b'yachid, b'magal echad, b'kupa echad, u'b'chol b'shlosha, b'shalosh kupot, u'b'shalosh magalot. So what you do with 3 people, you do only with 1 person on Shabbat. So they both seem to hold the same thing, right? Which is, right, Chachamim omrim echad Shabbat echad b'chol, shalosh kupot, b'shalosh magalot. Sorry, b'shalot, right, it should say, it's missing a word. B'shalosh should be 3 people, shalosh kupot and shalosh magalot. Anyway, Milo Ka'amar, here's the similarity. It does not say that Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim Hatam Kevan de Efshar Lo Tarchinan. Isn't what he's saying there is because there's a way to do it without needing 3. So if you have a way to minimize your Shabbat, right, your Chilul Shabbat, your desecration of Shabbat, you should limit it, just like Rabbi Yishmael says. And ideally, you should take 5 se'ah, but look, better to do 3 on Shabbat and minimize. You can manage with 3. It might not be the best product, but it's fine. You know, you should do it with 3 people for for same, right, for publicizing. But you could do it, or maybe for speed or whatever it might be. But you can manage with one as well. You'll end up with a pretty much end product, similar enough. So since you can manage without it, that's the word kevan de efshar, since it can be manageable without it, lo tarchinan, we don't let you do the extra. So hachanami, he would say the same thing as Rabbi Yishmael then, in Rabbi Yishmael's case, kevan de efshar lo tarchinan. And now comes the distinction. So this is nice because the Gemara is going to say, well, these two machlokot are actually different, and it's not clear that each would hold like the other. Mimai. Dilma adkan lo kama Rabbi Yishmael hacha ela deleka persume milta. When it's 5 se'ah versus 3 se'ah, and you can minimize to 3, and it's not going to make a big difference. It definitely doesn't affect the publicity of the matter. That's what he means, persume milta. It doesn't affect the publicity of it, whether you use 5 se'ah to get to your isaron, and your isaron is made of 5 se'ah, or your isaron is made of 3, came from 3. Aval hatam ika persume milta. But when you need 3 people in order to publicize it, maybe Rabbi Yishmael would hold publicizing the matter is of significant importance that it even overrides Shabbat. Inami, alternatively, you could say, again, we're going to do the same thing we did before, looking from the other side, maybe Rabbi Chanina said it here in how many people, because in the end, you're going to end up with the exact same final product. Nothing's going to be different whether you have 1 person cutting it or 3 people cutting it. So better off to minimize how many people are doing it. But for the purposes of this korban, right? So if you're going to have 3 people cut or 1 person cut, your final product you're going to bring before God is going to be exactly the same. But if you take 5 se'ah and try to get this fine flour, or the solet, this special flour from 5 se'ah, you're going to have a better final product than 3. So perhaps in that case, Rabbi Chanina would say we allow chilul Shabbat. Again, they're not going to exactly hold like the rabbis, because the rabbis say you don't even need 5, but the idea that Chol and Shabbat are the same, and if you need 5, then you do 5, okay? You can cut 5 on Shabbat because it's tzorach gavoa, right? If you take 3, according to that approach, right, of Rabbi Yishmael, 3 is not going to get you the best product. So perhaps Rabbi Yishmael says, fine, we're okay with that on Shabbat. Rabbi Chanina might say, no. If 5 is the ideal to get to your 10th, it's your 10th of an ephah, which is the best, right? You're going to get to a better one, a higher quality one from the 5. Ideal, better do that even on Shabbat. Right? So here, it's not going to be as good if you take 3. Maybe they hold like the rabbis, and you can do the same thing on Shabbat as you can do on a weekday. Okay, so that didn't work. To say these two machlokot are the same, we've now distinguished between them. Because again, one, if you focus on what the difference is, one is to publicize, but there's really no bottom line effect, right? So on the one hand, you have the one direction of maybe it's so important to publicize that could be Mechalel Shabbat. On the other hand, your final product is no different. Whereas the 5 and the 3, well, there's no Persume Milta on the one hand, so maybe we don't allow it. On the other hand, you're getting a worse final product. And maybe we want a better final product. Ela Amarav Ashi. Now we're going to have another attempt. Now it's here, it's not Rabbah, but it's somebody else. Rav Ashi comes in and says, Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi Amru Davar Echad. And again, we're going to bring something from some other sugya. It's a sugya in Rosh Hashanah. It also comes up in Shabbat about the Kiddush HaChodesh. Remember, we learned in Masechet Rosh Hashanah all about Kiddush HaChodesh, which is, if you learn Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which is when they would determine the new moon. And what happened? Witnesses would come and say, oh, we saw the new moon. So they would even allow it on Shabbat because you have to determine, right? They have to come, they hear the witnesses, and what do they have to say? And it's allowed to do on Shabbat because this is very important for determining the calendar, which determines all the holidays and all that. So let's say you have to travel. Let's say you live like me in Ranana and you have to get to Jerusalem. You're allowed to travel, even though you pass by Tchum Shabbat and other things, but you're allowed to do that to get there on Shabbat. Ditna. Now, what's Rabbi Yossi's position? Well, first we're going to see Tanakama. Bein shenireh ba'alil, bein shelo nireh ba'alil. Now, there's 2 ways you could see the new moon. One is where it's clear to everyone that there's a new moon. And one is that it's not so clear. You happen to see something. You happen to look up at the sky at the right moment and you saw the new moon. So that's 2 different cases, really. So Tanakama says it doesn't make a difference which way you saw it, whether it was completely clear or it wasn't so clear, but you think you saw it and you can go and testify about it. Mechalalim alav et haShabbat. Okay, you can go be Mechalel Shabbat to get to the court. The court will ask you the questions. You're not sure anyway in that other case whether you saw it, but they'll ask you questions. Did it look like this? Did it look like that? Determine if it's a new moon. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Im nireh ba'alil, em mechalalim alav et haShabbat. Rabbi Yossi says something very interesting. He says, if it's completely clear, then you desecrate Shabbat. If you live in Ranana, why would you come to Jerusalem? If it's so clear in the sky, obviously other people saw it. So there's no reason for you to desecrate Shabbat in order to get there when other people are doing it. And this is a topic we're going to talk about soon. When it comes to Pikuach Nefesh, okay? Is that the same thing? Do you say, well, other people will do it, right? We all know what happens when everyone says someone else will do it. So, right, in the end, it gets done by nobody. So we're going to talk about that soon. But right now, they assume that if it's so clear, people must have seen it, right? And you're not needed, so you shouldn't desecrate Shabbat. That's Rabbi Yossi. Now, the rabbis don't believe that. They think you should go anyway, and we'll see why in a minute. Milo amar Rabbi Yossi hata kevan de'efshar lo torchinan hachinami kevan de'efshar lo torchinan. So Rabbi Yossi says, right, it's same concept that we saw Rabbi Ishmael saying, as basically, if there's some other way to do it, don't bother, don't desecrate Shabbat. Shabbat, right, it's still there, this issue of Shabbat. It's true, we allow you to override Shabbat if you need to get to the court to testify, but not if you're not really needed. And yes, you're writing, well, the court see it. Yes, probably the court will see it. You might remember in the whole sugya of Kiddush Chodesh, there's a whole question, can the court actually determine? Because ein eid na'aseh dayan, right? There has to be eidim and there have to be court, right? You need judges to listen to the testimony. So there's a whole question specifically by Kiddush Chodesh, can those who saw it actually be the judges also? So anyway, that's a whole separate thing. So now, they say, no, these are not the same. Now, they forgot to tell you a very important element here, which is, why did the rabbi say that I can come from Ranana even if it's clear as day that the new moon was out? Because if I start saying and I start playing that game, next time I'll say, oh, I didn't go last time, someone else can do it, I won't go this time. And we need a system. We need this to work. We need to tell people, and this comes up in the army all the time about Chilul Shabbat. Okay, it comes up in my house in discussion all the time about what's allowed in the army, what's not, where do you draw the line, where's, what's okay, not okay to do while you're working on the job, it's sometimes very hard to start saying, oh, well, this, that, not, right? It's very complicated. If you say, well, I don't need to go this time, you might say, I don't need to go next time. And then nobody will come, and then we won't have the new moon determined properly because people won't come and testify. We need a system to work well. And in order to do that, we have to allow you sometimes even to be Mechalel Shabbat in a way that's not so important, right? Like, I'll give you a good example from the army. So all sorts of people walk around with telephones on Shabbat who are in the army, and many of them don't really need to, but their commander tells them you have to carry a phone because maybe we'll need you, right? Now, most of the time, they're probably not needed. And it could be even sometimes in training they do it. We're like, there's no way anyone's calling you up on Shabbat. But they have to get you used to the idea that you're going to walk around with a phone on Shabbat and you have no choice, right? And one day it's going to be needed. So basically, that's another kind of similar idea here. So now they say, so there's no concept of that anymore of, right? Basically what they're saying is, when Rabbi Ishmael said it, right? Maybe he only said it there, but here, right? There's no, I'm sorry, one second. There's no concern that if you do 3 se'ah on Shabbat instead of 5 se'ah, there's no concern that you're going to mess up next time. There's not a factor. Aval hatam, but here he might agree with the rabbis. He might take their position because they might say, listen, walk from Ranana. Go be Mechalel Shabbat, because if we don't let you now, you won't do it next time. Inami, alternatively, you could say the opposite, which is, again, from the other perspective. We wanted to say that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Ishmael said the same thing. So right now we said maybe Rabbi Ishmael wouldn't agree with Rabbi Yossi. Now we're going to say maybe Rabbi Yossi wouldn't agree with Rabbi Ishmael. Inami akamokam Rabbi Yossi hatam ela deleka tzorach gavoa v'lo nitna shabbat lidachot. Maybe Rabbi Yossi only said it when, right? He said, we can't be Mechalel Shabbat here because there's no tzorach gavoa, there's no sacrifices being affected by this. I mean, it's true, ultimately it affects when you bring sacrifices. But this isn't, I'm bringing a sacrifice to God and I want it to be the best possible. No, there's nothing of that there. So, and very interestingly, lo nitna shabbat lidachot. Whether I can come from Ranana or not is a yes, no, it's like a 1 or a 0. Either no, I can't be Mechalel Shabbat, or yes, I can be and I can do it. However, Aval Hacha, you'll see in a minute why I explained it that way. Aval Hacha, in the case of the Omer, what happened here? First of all, Dikat Sorach Gavoa, number one, it's for a korban, and Nitna Shabbat Lidachot. Shabbat was already overridden for me because I can cut the 3 se'ah. Once I cut 3 se'ah, so I could cut 5 se'ah. Shabbat was already overridden. So if I do a little more, what's the difference? Okay. Whereas there, it's a matter of yes, no. Can I be Mechalel Shabbat or can I not? It's not Shabbat is already pushed off for me and I could just do it in more or less. No, it's yes or no rather than more or less. So therefore, maybe Rabbi Yossi would say, maybe they agree in the Omer that you can do the 5. Again, the rabbis never said 5. We still have to go back to that same answer. But if you think there's a need for 5, then you would allow 5. And yes, it's like Hutra and Dechuya. It is very similar. I didn't want to start getting into it. We have a long daf and a lot of things, but same idea of like Truma Hutra, Shabbat Hutra. Is it permitted completely or is it Dechuya? Is it pushed off, but it's still there and you have to finagle, do it in the best way possible. Itmar. Now we get to a different machloket, but we're going to see that it's going to all come back to the Shabbos issue. Shachat shte chataot shel tzibur, ve'eno tzarich el achad. What chatat are you doing on Shabbat? The only time you would do a chatat on Shabbat, well, I'll give you one example of it. If it's Rosh Chodesh, remember on Rosh Chodesh and Chagim, there's Korban Chatat, Yizim Echad Chatat. We talked about that a lot in other Masechtot. When it comes, Lechaper Tumat Mikdash V'Kodashav and all that. But anyway, I'm going to put that aside right now. But there's a chatat you bring on Shabbat. Let's say in the temple they designated 2. Sometimes you designate 2 just in case something happens to one of them. But the person who was slaughtering didn't realize that's how it worked. And they thought that he had to slaughter both of them. So he accidentally slaughtered both of them. Now, you don't need to slaughter the second one on Shabbat. It's permitted to slaughter the sacrifice on Shabbat because it's the korban for that day. But you're not allowed to slaughter both of them, right? You're only allowed to slaughter one of them. I'm a Rabbah, the Itema Rabbi Ami. Remember this, who said it? Either Rabbah or Rabbi Ami. This is going to be important later. Chayav al hashniya u'patur l'rishona. Okay, that seems pretty obvious. Obviously, you're exempt for the first one. You're allowed to do it. The second one, you're going to be liable for. You're going to have to bring a Korban Chatat because you didn't realize it was a mistake, but you thought you could sacrifice on Shabbat, slaughter, but you were wrong. Now, here comes the Chiddush though. Afilu nitkaper lo b'shniya. Even if in the end, let's say the order was like this. You slaughtered number 1, you didn't sprinkle the blood yet. You slaughtered number 2, and then for whatever reason, you sprinkled the blood of the second animal first. And that was the one where you ultimately got the atonement for it. That was your real sacrifice. But it doesn't matter because it's the moment of shechita that determines it. At the moment you slaughter it, were you allowed to slaughter it? No. So even if in the end that becomes your korban, it doesn't matter. You still sinned by slaughtering it. And that's his chiddush. And second chiddush, afilu nimtzait rishona chusha. If you, after you slaughter the animal, sometimes you open it up and then you see the animal is super lean and not a good quality animal. And the other one is fat. So let's say after you slaughter both of them, you realize that the first one was very lean and not really the one you should bring on the altar. And then you want to basically then finish sacrificing the second one, still, okay, just like in the first case we said with the blood, still you sinned by slaughtering it. Because again, at the moment of slaughtering, you didn't realize it was lean. It wasn't something you could tell until you opened the animal after it was slaughtered. So at the moment of slaughtering, you weren't allowed to do it. So you have to bring a sin offering. So now they say, right, it's confusing. The sin offering was what you originally brought. Now you have to bring a different sin offering because you actually sinned. Okay, not to confuse them. So now they say, wait a minute. We said either Rabbah or Rabbi Ami said this. So now they say, Rabba Hachi, how could Rabbah have said this? V'ha'amar Rabbah, hayu lefanav shtei chataot. If you case is the exact same case. You had 2 in front of you. Echad shmena v'echad chusha. One was fat and one was lean. Shachat shmena v'achar kal shachat chusha chayav. If first you slaughtered the fat one, which is the one you were supposed to, and then you slaughtered the lean one for no reason, then chayav. You're liable for slaughtering it, obviously. But chusha v'achar kal shmena patur. But if you first did the lean one, not realizing it was lean, then you slaughtered the fat one, and then you realized the lean one was actually lean, and then you wanted to then sacrifice the second one, patur. He actually says that's fine, because in the end, even though you slaughtered it first, when you shouldn't have, but in the end you needed it, so you're exempt. So that seems to be the opposite of what he said by us. V'lo od ela, and not only that, ela shomrim lo, havei shmena lechatchila ushchot. They'll say to you, if you saw the first one and find out it's kusha, they'll say, go slaughter another one because we don't want your kusha korban. We don't like the lean ones. It's not appropriate. It's like part of that pasuk in Malachi, like we read it, right? You're going to bring something to God that's just not nice. It doesn't make any sense. You want something nice. So that seems to be a complete contradiction for what we said, Rabbi said a minute ago. Either get rid of the words, even the kusha, okay, and there were two cases. Even nitkaper lo b'shniya, even if you use the blood of the second one instead of the first, or even if it turns out the first one was lean. If you just get rid of those words and just say, oh, he didn't really say the second part, that was added by accident, then you can resolve the problem. Or maybe an easier way is Rabbi Ami Amara. Remember we said either Rabbi said it or Rabbi Ami said it. So since this contradicts Rabba, that's a good way to determine it was actually Rabbi Ami and not Rabba who said it. And then that resolves the contradiction because there is no contradiction. Amalei Ravina L'Ravashi. Now this leads to a very interesting question. Okay, this case, which is going to lead us to other cases. So if when you open the first one and you find out that it was very lean inside, when you see the innards, mahu. And then again, you had already slaughtered the second one. Batar machshavto azlina v'gaver li'isura kamachavim. Do we say it doesn't matter that in the end it was lean and we need the second one? We go based on what the person's thoughts were, and his thoughts were to do something forbidden. Now, this is a little bit strange because we're talking that it was shogeg. He didn't realize it was forbidden. But what we mean is he thought to do an action that unwittingly was wrong, okay? And it's very interesting because if someone actually intended to do something Isser, we could say your machshav is important. This is saying your machshav is important because you intended to do an action that in the end that action was forbidden at that moment, okay? Your intentions at that moment was to slaughter the second one for absolutely no reason. Turns out later there was a reason, but you didn't know that at the time. So this is the fascinating question. Do we go by what you were thinking at the time, which was, again, you didn't know it was forbidden, but whatever you planned to do was a forbidden action. By accident, you did it, but it was a forbidden action. Or do we say, or we go, we don't care what you were thinking to do then, that you were thinking to do it and it was wrong at the time. We go by in the end, what's the result? The result is, in the end, you needed the second one because the first one was no good. And what we care about is the final product. In the end, you needed that second one, so you actually didn't do anything wrong at all. Amravle lav hainu to Rabba v'Rava. So he answers him. Ravashi says, isn't that what Rabba and Rava have an argument about? But we're going to see in this version, because we're going to have two versions of their argument. In this version, they actually both agree about what the answer to the question would be. And we'll see in a minute what it is. Second version, we're going to say it's exactly the machloket between the two of them. But we're going to have a case, very interesting case, and it comes. Now we're getting to pikuach nefesh on Shabbat and how Shabbat is overridden. Right before we talk about Shabbat overridden for the sake of korbanot or something needed in the temple, something like that. But here we're going to talk about Shabbat overridden for pikuach nefesh, for saving a life. De'itmar shamasha tavat tinok bayam. Somebody hears that there's a child that's drowning in the water, and paras mitzuda la'alot dagim ve'ela dagim chayav. Now I happen to be fishing at the time with a net. I put my net in the water. I'm not intending to save this child. It's not my interest. I'm busy doing my fishing. And I put in my net. I pick up fish. I'm obligated. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Now, if I'm sitting there fishing, I hear that there's a kid drowning, but I really don't care. I keep fishing. I'm doing my own business. And in my net comes fish and the child. And I save the child's life. And it's Shabbat. Rava Amar Chayav. Rava says, I don't care what you did in the end. You did, right? What were you doing? You were fishing on Shabbat. Of course you're obligated. Rabba Amar Patur. Rava says, you're exempt, okay, because you saved a life. But pay attention. According to this version, Akan Rabba Lo Kapatal Ela Kevan Shama. What was the case? The case was I heard there was a child, and I just continued doing my own business. But I hear this child drowning. Now, most people, when they hear this kid drowning, even if they're still minding their own business and fishing, since they know that when they're fishing, they could possibly save this child as well. Maybe the child will come up in the net. Amrina nami tinok. We can give the person the benefit of the doubt and assume they must have also somewhere maybe in their subconscious, even if not in their conscious, they were also thinking maybe they'll save the child. And that's why this case, that's why he says that. But aval shlo shamalo. But if he didn't know there was a child there and bimikre, just happened to be while they were fishing, a child who was drowning comes up in their net and they save the child's life, well, then for sure we're not going to exempt them, okay? Because they weren't doing it for the sake of saving the child. this case, they weren't doing it either, but it's enough to say probably they were thinking somewhere in the back of their minds about the child. So what do you see here? They both in the end say that what? We go by in the end, right? What your intent was, right? If your intent was really not to save the child, then we don't care in the end if you save the child. You're liable. Okay? So that's what they would say here as well. Right? Even though the second one was needed, it doesn't matter. You slaughtered it, visu, with an intent of forbidden action. But that's exactly the machlok between them, because here's the second version. If you heard there was a child drowning, but you're minding your own business, fishing, okay, but what if while you were doing it, you also brought in the child, but you weren't intending to? Rabba Amar Patur, Rabba Amar Chayav. Rabba Amar Patur, Zil Batar Ma'asav. Rabba says in the end, it's true, you were desecrating Shabbat, but you saved a life. So in the end, Shabbat was overridden for you because you saved a life. So it's true you got fish as well, which you shouldn't have, but you're not liable for that action. Because all we care about is the bottom line, what happened in the end. And that would say, in the previous case, that would go the opposite, the opposite of what we said before. If the first one happened to be kusha, which you didn't know at the time, doesn't matter that you didn't know. In the end, you needed the second one, so you're not going to be liable for slaughtering it. It's almost like crazy that we're going to make you liable for an action that actually was in the end permitted, right? That's the idea here. Rava says you're obligated because we don't care. It's what your intent was. Right? So this is fascinating about your intent versus what actually happened in the end. Amar Rabba. Okay, now we get to another very interesting case. We have a sick child or a person who needs one fig. Okay, if they get that fig, they'll be able to live. That's what the doctor said. 10 people ran, and they each come back with a fig. Now in the end, all we need is one fig. 10 people brought the fig. Either they cut the fig off the tree, or they carried it in the public domain, or they did both. Okay, those are the malachas. P'turim. Okay, they're all exempt because they all tried to save a life, right? This is the value of saving a life. We don't care that 10 people desecrated Shabbat and there was no need, because if we don't allow that, what's going to happen? Everyone's going to say, oh, someone else will do it, and we all know what happens then, that nobody ends up doing it. Even if they came out one after the other, even not at the same time. If the first person comes and gives the child the fig, and after that, I didn't know, but after that, I cut the fig off the tree, and then I brought it, and then I didn't know the child was saved, though. I'm still exempt because I did it with the intent to save this child's life, and Shabbat was overridden for that purpose. Okay, that's taking it much farther, right? But in a very a way that makes a lot of sense. By Rava. Rava now asks, and with this last question, we're going to end the sugya and start the next Mishnah. They said this person needs 2 figs. And I go to the tree, and there's either 2 on 2 separate branches, which is the amount that I need, or 1 branch with 3 figs. Now, I don't need 3 figs, but if I cut 1 branch, I'm doing less malacha. So do I cut the 1 branch and get 3, even though I only need 2? Or do I cut the 2 branches, make 2 cuts, which is 2 averot, basically, but again, it's permitted to me to bring the 2, because that's the exact number we need. So, hey, minayu matina, which one do we bring? Shtayin matina dechazule. Do we bring 2 because that's what the person needs? Odil shalosh matina to come in my ktsira. Do we say I bring 3 because that's the least, right? I'm doing the least amount of malacha. Pshita shalosh matina. They say it's obvious you bring 3, turning out on the bet. When now we're going back to Rabbi Yishmael, we're going to kind of close circle. When Rabbi Yishmael said that you can take only 3 se'in to get it to an isaron instead of 5, he said that because by cutting down the number from 5 to 3, and even though really you need 5, but we're going to cut it down to 3 because that's going to be cutting the shiur of how much you're going to cut also cuts down how much malacha you're going to do, because you're going to cut a lot less stuff. But here, if you bring less, 2 instead of 3, which you would have thought 3 instead of 5 in the case of the se'ah, in this case it would be 2 figs instead of 3, kamafsha ktsira. You're going to do more cutting. And therefore, vadai shalosh matina, for sure you're going to bring 3. Better to minimize malacha, even if it means you're going to bring more figs. Okay. With that, we end. Fascinating sugyot. I feel like you could spend a good week learning these in depth and comparing all the different cases. And it's one of those dafim you just say, wow, I wish we had more time. But maybe for another opportunity. Okay. New Mishnah. Mitzvah Omer Lavi Min HaKarov. You're supposed to bring it from the closest place. In a minute in the Gemara, we'll see where that comes from. Lo bikara karov liYerushalayim. If the crops weren't ready yet, they weren't ripe enough. Mivi'ino tomi komakom. So they try to find it closest to Jerusalem. If they can't find, they go for wherever they can find it. Maaseh sheba haomer migagot tzrifim u'shtei alecha mibek'at ein sochil. So there was a case where they had to go all the way. Okay, it's not the farthest, but for them it was far. All the way to Gagot Tzrifin. Tzrifin is a place not far from Rehovot. And not Rehovot, not far from Rishon LeZion, sorry. So it's also not far from Rehovot. It's in that general area. Ushte alecha mibik'at ein socher, which is in the Shomron. Okay, so when it came time for the Omer, crop wasn't ready, the barley crop, they had to bring it from farther away. And when the Shtei Alechem needed the wheat for Shavuot, they had to go farther away to ein socher. Now, we're going to get the background story to this whole thing. I will mention that the Yerushalmi, there's a different version of the story that led to this. Okay, there's just like, all these stories that always come about. What would it, what happened when, why did they have to bring it from this far place? And we'll have a very interesting story that we already learned before. But the first thing we have to do is figure out why we're supposed to bring it from close by. Two possible reasons. My time, mishum Carmel. If you remember, the pasuk talks about the Mincha Omer needs to be Carmel. Carmel means fresh, soft. Rashi says if you bring it from far, it's going to harden by the wind. Like the wind is going to come and blow, and it's going to make the grains harder. So you want them as soft as possible. So you want to travel as less as the least possible amount that you can. A second option, mishum de'em avirin ala mitzvot. Okay, what does that mean? It's a famous idea that you shouldn't pass up an opportunity for a mitzvah. If you're leaving Jerusalem to go get the Omer and you pass by a field that has stuff that's ripe, you shouldn't say, oh, I'll push off the mitzvah and I'll go find other ones. No, you should do it as quickly as possible. Okay, you want to go in depth into this, and your Hebrew is good. So Sugya B'Tana of Mirab Tubakana is on this topic and in different areas where this idea of Em Avrin Ala Mitzvah comes up. It's, again, another interesting in-depth thing to go into. Okay, we're going to go on. It's actually not up on the site yet, but because the word just got to us last night, so it'll go up as Rat Hashem today, hopefully. Okay, Maaseh Shabami Gagot Tzrifim. Now we get into what was this Maaseh. So according to the Bavli here, this is the story. Tanu Rabbanan, Kshetzamu Malchei Beit Chashmonai Zalzel. Okay, there were kings, Chashmonaim kings, that fought with each other. We're talking about two brothers, Horkanus and Aristobulus. They were the sons of Shlomtzi Hamalka, and she basically made Horkanus the king, and Aristobulus rebelled, and then he sought refuge in Jerusalem, and Horkanus put a siege on the city. So every day they would take money, they would pay money, they would put it outside the wall. The people inside, Aristobulus and his people wanted to bring sacrifices, so they took money out, right? They had no animals inside, so they had to get animals from outside, and they would get animals. Okay, according to Josephus, I read this in the Koran footnote. I always have good footnotes about these things. According to Josephus in the story, they jacked up the prices so that they would basically cause the people inside to go broke, right? But they still paid these large amounts of money to get the sacrifices. Okay, so every day they would give them money and they would give them the animals. If you didn't remember the story, maybe you'll start to remember the details soon. Whole debate what exactly Chokhmah Yavanit is. That's where the sugya came up in Sota in the context of Chokhmah Yavanit, and we're going to see this soon. But he knew some other language, whether it's different language, whether it was like a way of codes, something like that. So he gave some info to the people outside the wall that were putting on the siege, Horkanus's people, in some other language, so the people inside wouldn't understand. Amar lahem, he said to them, look, as long as they keep doing their sacrifices, you're not going to beat them. The reason why you're not winning this war is because God is helping them. And if they stop giving sacrifices, God will stop helping them. So the next day, they give them money. This is the part you probably remember the story, right? They gave them a pig. Okay, so the pig starts going over the wall, the siege they put on. It gets halfway up the wall. So the pig, right, normally would do, right, grabs onto the wall, And Nizdaza Eretz Yisrael Abrameo Parsa Abrameo Parsa. Okay, the huge earthquake happens, and some people say the whole land of Israel is 400 parsa by 400 parsa. Right, 400 is always this number they love to use in stories. A big number. The whole earth shook. Okay, whether we're going to see, because why are we at this? We need to find out why they had to go far to find the Omer. Some people think the whole earth shook and it ruined the crops that were nearby Jerusalem. That's possibly one version, or just it caused this crazy, like, oh my God, what a terrible thing that a chazir is going to be used as a sacrifice in the temple. Bo'tasha amru. At that moment they said, Arur shigadel chazir, curses the person who breeds pigs. Ve'arur shilameh beno chochma yivanit, and curses the person who teaches his son chochma yivanit. This is why the city comes up about can you learn chochma yivanit or not. In other places, again, that's not the purpose of it here. And by the way, about that time, now it's not clear, but it was specifically because of this story, as I said, everything shook, and ruined the crop, or perhaps it meant that in this same time period that there was this siege going on in the city and this war going on between the two brothers, perhaps we're going to destroy the crops around Jerusalem, or maybe in the war, we don't know exactly, but for some reason the crops were ruined that year, perhaps directly connected or to this particular incident, or just directly connected to the whole war going on between the two brothers. And what happened? Shabbat Omer. So in that year, they had to bring the Omer from Gagot Srifim to. Now, how did they know where to go? So now we get the back. Now we go back in time a little bit. Kimata Omer. So now that year when the Omer came, Lo v'yadu mehechayte Omer. They didn't know where they were going to bring it from. Achrizu. So Achrizu, they said, okay, who knows where we can find barley crop? Nowadays, like it's put on Facebook, who's got the best barley crop or something like that. But in those days, what they do, the only way they have is to announce, so they announce it. A chiresh comes. Now, chiresh usually means deaf, but also means deaf mute. In this case, it means just mute. Obviously, he wasn't deaf, otherwise he wouldn't have heard the announcements. So a deaf person, or again, a mute, comes. Otiv chadiyada igra, v'chadiyada tzripa. Okay, if you ever knew this, charades existed in the time of the Beit Cheshmonaim. We're talking even before the Mishnah, okay? First game of charades. So what does he do? He puts his finger on the roof, which is gagot, and he puts his hand on a tzrif, on a hut, and basically, they said, Amar lehu Mordechai. So Mordechai, which Rashi says is Mordechai from the time of the Megillah, which Tosafot says, what are you talking about? He couldn't have lived that long and be alive in the time of the Cheshmonaim. That was hundreds of years later. So it was someone named Mordechai. We'll talk a little bit about him more tomorrow. Right? He sees the two, puts it together. He realizes he's playing charades. He says, is there a place by this? But they found, right? He wasn't sure which order to do it in. I don't know why the guy didn't say one, this, two, that, right? It would have been clear. But anyway, he finds the place and they're good. So then, now comes the time of Shavuot. They need wheat now. So they found the barley, but they didn't know where wheat was. Same thing. So they made an announcement. I'm not clear if it's the same person, but another mute person comes. He puts one hand on his eye. And one on the Rashi says the sichra is the part where the bolt goes in the door. Amar lehu Mordechai, mi kaduchta dishma in socher or socher ayin. Is there a place called socher ayin or in socher? But kuv eshkachu, and they found it. Okay, Hanu. Okay, so now what you see here, I want to just point out, we had the guy who had the chokhmah yivanit, and he had this code language, right? Mordechai seems to also be able to know codes and understand how people are talking. And now we're going to have another story about Mordechai in this next case, and we'll just start it today and finish it up tomorrow. We'll finish up to the end of today's daf. Hanu shalosh nashim da'ite shalosh kinim. Now, these three women brought 3 pairs of birds. If you remember the way it would work, people would bring money for the birds, the pair of birds that they have to bring to sacrifice. Often women, either they're after childbirth or a zava, and they bring these pairs of birds. And then it's a chatat and an ola. One is chatat, one is ola. And then the kohanim would get the money and they would then sacrifice them. But there's also pairs of birds that people bring as voluntary offerings. Like I want to bring an offering and I don't want to spend it on animals, so I do birds. And then they're both olas. I don't bring a voluntary offering of a chatat. So you have to know, right, when the kohen gets the pair of birds, it doesn't say on it chatat ola or what it is. So but they usually say what they're bringing it for. So what happened? These 3 women came. Chada amra lizivati, for my zava, which sounds pretty clear, zava. Chada amra leyamati, for my water over, like we don't know exactly what this means. My yam, yam is a sea, so we don't know what that means. And chad amra la'onati, for my time, okay, my time of the month or something. Okay, now you don't bring for your period, okay, just for zava, which is bleeding more than the days of your period when it's not the days that you're supposed to be menstruating. So otherwise, there's no korban for a nida. So now, what did the Kohanim think? Savramine, zivati zava mamash. So the first one seemed pretty clear. This is my korban for zava, one lechatat, one laolah. Liyamati mamash. Now, what do they assume? That means my flow. So also zava. I had a big flow, and that's what I'm bringing it for. Lo onata. For my time. What's my time? Well, you have to count 7 clean days and on the 8th day. So it must be saying, well, this is my time, my 8th day, also zavas. So they assumed they were all zavas and they were going to bring one for ola, one for chatat. Tekulu chad chatat v'chad ola. Amar lahu Mordechai. Maybe you didn't understand them because again, he knows the way people speak. He says, Shema bezov sikna. Maybe she was in danger because she was bleeding so much. And she said, if I get saved from this, I will bring a korban, and then it's 2 olas. Shema bayam sikna. Maybe yamati means I was in the sea and I almost drowned, and I'm bringing it, right? And that. Shema be'ena sikna. Maybe she had a problem, but onata, maybe she meant be'enata, her eye. That's a little already stretch. Tekulu olot minhu. And then they would all be olas, and then you're going to bring them all wrong. Baduk ve'eshkach. Okay, just like the other story. Baduk, right? They searched and they found. So they went back to the women based on Mordechai's his suggestion, and it turns out he was right. We're going to continue the story and see more later. But anyway, that's for today. So what did we started with the whole thing about Shabbat and when you can be Mechalel Shabbat and when Shabbat is pushed off. And does that mean you can push it off entirely? Does that mean you have to still be careful within, depending on what the circumstance, if it's the Torah Gavon, maybe yes, if it's not, if it's, right? We had all different comparisons of cases. And like I said, you could probably spend a whole month just analyzing all these different cases and going more in depth about them. And then when someone's sick, right? And we want to encourage people to do things. Also with the Kiddush HaChodesh, we saw that elements. There were all different elements that came up in this comparison. And it was all really comparing all different cases. And are these people really saying the same thing? Or maybe they wouldn't say the same thing in the other case. Then we get to the mitzvah Omer, ideally bring it from close by, and the Shtei Alechem also, but in an event that you don't have to, so that you can't, so bring it from farther away. And then they said there was a case where it happened, and then we got the whole story. And from there, we got into all different understandings of what people mean and what when they say things, and that also related, right, because of the Ein Sofer story, how to show what they meant, and people who understand code, and we'll get more back to that story and finish it up at the beginning of tomorrow's talk. Wishing everyone a good day and a safe and a quiet day.